We know that postmodernists of a certain bent pay a great deal of attention to the shape and form of a literary work, of a novel or a short story. Furthermore, we know that sometimes these postmodernists will extrapolate that to pay attention to a bunch of these things as they come together. So collections of short stories that may have themes or a certain shape or form. We've seen this kind of thing from Chuck Palahniuk, Robert Coover, Gene Wolfe, John Barth, Stanislaw Lem, Alistair Gray, William Gass, David Foster Wallace, where they'll extrapolate this idea of form and shape to an entire collection of short stories, or indeed to a series or a set of novels that come together. We see that from Mark Danielewski, for instance, with The Familiar. And so why would you not extrapolate that a bit more if you're the kind of postmodernist who cares a lot about form, to the shape of a career? And I have 3 examples today of postmodernist fiction authors who did exactly that. So let's start with John Barth. If you want to talk about one author who paid attention to himself and form and the form of his work, John Barth is the most obvious one. He never made anything that wasn't considered, or he didn't think about the form that it took and what it should be and what it's like. And also where he wasn't continually thinking about not only his work as artifacts of an author, of the result of authorship, but himself as the author. And over the course of his career, you see that becoming more and more the theme, where these characters keep showing up in John Barth's book that look more and more like John Barth. And the characters change as John Barth changes over the course of his career. So even if it's something entirely fantastical, like The Last Voyage of Somebody the Sailor, that is alternating between 2 different viewpoints. And one is the viewpoint of a young woman in essentially the Scheherazade stories, right? In a time and place that never really existed. And then the other one next to it, the next chapter, is a guy who looks exactly like John Barth, right? He's a college professor of the same age and an author of a certain kind of fiction. And these 2 stories are interwoven, but that one person, that just is John Barth. And so as more time goes on, it gets more and more like that. So this is somebody who's very focused on himself. So why would this person not in particular, if anyone was going to try to shape his career, John Barth would be the guy. So the first thing he published, his first book, is The Floating Opera. And this novel here, The Floating Opera, starts with the first chapter is called Tuning My Piano. And this is written in the first person I, and presumably that is Todd Andrews, the first person narrator of this book, the character in this book. But what he does is he explains. Basically, he's got this whole chapter, which sort of is not about the things of the book, but rather it's about me as a storyteller and how I am going to tell you this story. And the idea being tuning my piano. I have to kind of wind my way into it. I have to kind of get a little momentum and get going. And as I get going, then I'm going to be able to push through and tell you this book. So that's the very first thing we ever get from him. He hasn't published short stories, but in terms of a thing under a cover that we can put on our shelf and say, this is part of our Barth collection. The first thing we ever get from him, the very beginning of the very first thing, is Tuning My Piano, and it's about how I start and I gain momentum. And then from there, Barth keeps going, and he gives us a bunch of novels and a bunch of books of short stories and a bunch of books of literary criticism, and he's spending his whole kind of career. He's writing, not only is he writing this work, but he's writing about writing, and he's writing about the kind of writing he does and the kind of writing he likes. And he has this massive long career. And finally, he's in his 90s, and he publishes his last book in his 90s. And his last book is Postscripts, subtitle Just Desserts. And let's look at the introduction to Postscripts a little bit. So he starts out, for the first decade of my publishing career, my genre of choice was the novel. And he gives a couple sentences about what he did. And then it comes down to, now in my 90s, having perpetrated 11 novels, 2 novella triads, 4 short story series, and 3 essay collections, I find myself attracted to the even shorter form of mostly one-page jeu d'esprit with the titles Postscripts and the subtitle Just Desserts. So what he's doing here is he's putting a punctuation mark on the end of his career, right? He's gone through what he's going through, and we're getting to at the end, he's going to give us a postscript. Just like in a book, you might have a postscript. And he's inviting us, therefore, to think of everything he wrote before that as a single body, as a single narrative train. Now, this is the guy who, in his novel Letters, his 7th novel, decided to incorporate one character each from each of his preceding, not his 7th novel, his 7th published book. One of them was Lost in the Funhouse, a book of short stories. But in his 7th published book, he decided to incorporate one character each from each of his 6 previous published books, even though they were set in radically different places and times, and one of them was set in a fictional world that didn't even exist, right? So already you see somebody who's looking back at his own career and trying to give it a bigger shape. And so he keeps going through his career, and his career is all full of these look-backs at his previous work, these little return to the motifs and these little kind of touchstones on his earlier works. Well, he'll go back and he'll reference his earlier works in a way, whereas if you read all of his works in order, you'll see those references. So this is someone who's thinking those terms. He's already been shaping a full career, and now he's going to end it, having shaped this whole full career with postscripts. Now, if you want to do this kind of thing, I think there are some criteria you have to have. First of all is, again, you have to have that predilection. Your mind has to work that way. You have to say, I think about form, and I think about form a lot, right? And I have strong opinions about form. The next thing that has to happen is I think you have to have a certain amount of reputation. You've got to be known, right? If people don't know you, then how can you shape your career? How can you shape your reputation? So it has to be someone where you're conscious of the fact and you're aware of the fact in your lifetime, not posthumously, but in your lifetime, you're aware of the fact that there is a meaningful audience of people who are engaged enough with what you're saying in your art that this is a statement that you can make and you can get through to them. And then I think the last thing is you just have to have a big enough opus of work that there's something actually to shape. For, somebody who had like one breakout novel, or, a set of few dozen short stories published around magazines, but there's nothing you can really lasso together into any kind of coherent shape. For that kind of person, for someone in that condition, even if you have that predilection and even if you have those ideas, it's just not practically possible. But for the people we're talking about here, it is. The second example, who I very closely associate with John Barth, as I've mentioned in my 10 Titans of Postmodernism, is Robert Coover. And Robert Coover is like Barth in a lot of ways, including the fact that he had a long career. And he published lots of stuff, and he has a huge body of work. And he was publishing all the way until he was in his 90s. Now, Coover starts out, he has some short stories, but the first thing that is published under its own cover is The Origin of the Brunists. And The Origin of the Brunists is traditionalism. It's the story of there's a mining town, a small town that's all about the mine, the coal mine, and there's a mine collapse, and only one person escapes, and local people view it as a hero, and this kind of cult grows around him. And he's not even like the cult leader. He's just this guy, but he becomes the object of this cult that kind of forms around him, and he's more an object than an actor. And it's a good book, and it's pure traditionalism. Like, unless you want to talk about, he's dabbling with the ideas of perception and stuff, but for the most part, I would call this pure traditionalism. And what Coover said about this is that he was of the opinion that he had to prove to himself and to others, those around him, right, his audience, his industry, publishers, agents, people along those lines, editors, that he had the chops to create a traditional novel so that they would take it seriously when he went into the experimentalism that he really wanted to do. And I'm reminded of a story about Pablo Picasso. I don't know if this is true or apocryphal, but the story goes that somebody was criticizing Picasso. They were saying the only reason he painted the kinds of things he painted was he didn't have the ability to paint realistically. And supposedly the response to that was Picasso took a pen or a pencil and a blank sheet of paper and free-handed a perfect circle, as if you had drawn it with a compass. The point being, no, I got the chops. I'm just doing the kind of art I wanted. And that was Coover's situation. He wanted to show people he could do this so that for the rest of his career, he could do the kind of art he wanted to do. That's what he reports. So this is the first book. This is the beginning of the bookend. So now we go to late, much later in Coover's career. He's well into his late 80s. He's in his late 80s. And he's been publishing just at a regular cadence the whole time. No slowdown, no nothing. He's got lots of books. And in the late 80s, we get this one, The Brunist Day of Wrath. Now, the first thing I'll point out is this is an enormous book. I probably should have had this in my mega novels episode, and if you're interested in mega novels, go watch that episode, please. I just kind of forgot about it, and so I didn't get into that. But this is more than 1,000 pages. This is a mega novel. But this, again, is a traditional novel. Apart from its mega novel form, apart from that, and the fact that it's a reprise of this is a traditional novel. It's going back, and it's talking all these years later. It's going back to the same town, and talking about the Brunists, they're still around, and what they are, and new events. That's an update of the events of the origin of the Brunists. Now, so this is a sequel to this book. Okay, no big, right? But this is a sequel to this book a whole career later, when he's retired as a college professor and he's put all of these books behind him and he is coming at this, and what absolutely could be, you can imagine Coover sitting down to write this novel, this giant novel, saying, this may be the last book I publish. And I remember when this came out, I said to myself, oh, is Coover going to hang it up? Is he done? Is he just going to stop printing? Because they're perfect bookends. He's got the Brunists, he's got the Brunists. Traditionalism, with this big career of wild experimentalism in between. And you could see a guy like Robert Coover, who pays so much attention to form, saying, that is just too good, I can't let that go. And I was afraid that he was going to do that he was going to stop. Now, fortunately, he didn't. And he gave us several more things, and they're of a theme. And the last two, and the other one I forgot to bring over, but the last two things that he published, one of them is called Street Cop. And that's the one I forgot, so I'll just talk about it. We'll return to Street Cop in the future when we talk about books with interesting form factors. But one of them is called Street Cop, and Street Cop is the story of this street cop who is in an era where the police have been entirely replaced by robots. So all the other police are robots, and they're walking around doing their functions as robots with their robotic vehicles and the robotic police. And they are just more efficient and effective than he is. And even this police is being guided a lot. He's got these haptic boots that use vibrations to tell him where to go. So he's literally being told where to go. And he's got this basically phone thing that's his, quote unquote, his dispatcher. And his dispatcher is an AI. The words and the voice and the image of the woman on that screen are all computer generated. There's no real human there, and it's telling him what to do. And you get the sense in Street Cop that it doesn't really matter what he does, that he's not deemed to be an important part of the law enforcement infrastructure. It's more like that he's just being allowed to do this until he retires, right? They've moved on and they're just they've grandfathered him and then they're just going to let him do his thing until retirement comes. And there even is a suggestion that perhaps he is the last human cop, right? That everybody else is already retired and he's the only one who hasn't hit that time yet. So there is this, this sense now for somebody who's now into his 90s and has been publishing since he was young and has this huge number of books behind him and writing about writing and, teaching at the college and all of that stuff. You do notice the theme of that. And it feels like it's a statement about being at the end of one's career, because it is. And then the last book he published is this one, Open House. And what happens in Open House is there's this party. And it's an open house. And it's the top floor, it's the whole top floor, it's the penthouse of this high-rise building. And people are going up to this party, and it's just chock full of people, and these people are all walks of life. There's college professors and criminals and very uptighty people and very kind of happy people and young and old and all races and sexes and everything. There's a pregnant woman there, like you got sort of a microcosm of humanity up jammed into this place. And various crazy things are going on, but as you're there, one of the things that becomes clear is you can't go down. The elevators only come up. You cannot ride an elevator down, and you cannot take the stairs down. There is no stairwell. You just fall into a gap. And as the story goes on, more people wind up going over the edge of the terrace and falling. And there's lots and lots of people wind up basically either falling or jumping or being flung off this building. And there's this implication that that's the only way anyone is going to ever leave. And new people are coming in the elevator all the time, and people are going out by going off the side. And it's easy to see this as a metaphor for life, right? That this is how it goes. We come to the open house, and there's only one way we're ever going to leave the open house, and we're all going to leave that way eventually. And again, for somebody who's been thinking about this and writing about this for his whole career, and now he's in his 90s, and he knows, even if he does great, how much time is he really going to have? To write a book, to read a book like this, I feel like this is somebody saying, I'm going to make some statements at the end of my career about the end of my career and my life as a writer. And that occurring where it is, maybe that's the kind of thing that somebody thinks about. Maybe that has to do with it. But also, again, with Robert Coover, someone who pays so much attention to form, you've got to imagine, he said, with Street Cop and this one, that these are statements I'm making. These are the statements I'm making at the end because they're appropriate as statements to be made at the end. Shaping a career. The third example I want to give you, I can't hold up a book because it's an example from film, and it's Quentin Tarantino. Now, I'm a big Quentin Tarantino fan. We haven't talked about Tarantino yet. We will in this channel for sure. And Tarantino absolutely is a postmodern filmmaker. And we'll get into that. If it's not obvious, we'll get into that and why we feel that way. But Tarantino, as of recording time, has made many statements to the effect that he is going to make one more film and then he... So as of recording time, the last film that he published was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And Once Upon a Time in Hollywood itself, when I went and I saw that movie, I thought, oh, is this Tarantino's last movie? Because Once Upon a Time in Hollywood views like a love letter to Hollywood and a love letter to a Hollywood of the past, of Tarantino's childhood. And almost, it felt in a lot of ways like a very affectionate goodbye. Now, again, he says there will be one more film. I expect there will be at least one more film. It's possible he changes his mind and there's more films that come after that. But why will there only be one more film? Tarantino has been very explicit about this on a lot of occasions. He says that, I look at other filmmakers and they always, their last film is always their worst one. And they go until they can't do it anymore, and they gradually get worse and worse and worse over time until they're remembered as being a joke and being lousy, as opposed to the great people they were when they were at the top of their game. And I don't want to be remembered that way. I want to be remembered how I was at the top of my game. So even though Tarantino is still quite young and could have decades of productivity in him, he's already thinking about that. He's thinking about the arc of his career. And he's thinking about not wanting the arc of that career to have a certain kind of ignominious end. He wants it to have a good, strong ending. And that is shaping his decisions about not only, when and how he's going to make films, but also, I put it to you, when you look at Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, about the films he's choosing to make. Because that last film is a film that, again, very much is about a Hollywood insider and a lover of this particular sort of media, who also was an important popularizer and somebody who made that kind of media into more into high art than it had been before. Going and saying, I'm going to make sure that the entirety of my career is shaped in a way where it is honorable and people remember me affectionately and fondly. So once again, that is someone shaping their career. So to do this, as a reminder, most people don't have the chance. You have to have a lot of success, and you have to be prolific, and you have to have a big career for a long time. And even then, most people aren't doing that. They're just kind of thinking about their next work. But you get a few people who are really focused on this kind of thing, and they start to think in these terms. I'm sure there are other examples of this, and I would love to hear what they are. So I'm going to invite you, the audience, to go to the comments and tell me about the examples you see of literary artists, storytelling artists in fiction or film or whatever the medium, who have deliberately shaped their own career with an eye toward what that looks like as an entire career. Thank you.